Dragon is one of Magic's oldest and most iconic creature types, with Shivan Dragon kicking things off all the way back in 1993. In time, Dragon came to be officially considered Red's iconic creature type by Wizards of the Coast, which means that dragons are big powerful creatures that largely appear at higher rarities and represent what the color is all about. With the release of Tarkir Dragonstorm not that far off, I thought it would be a good time to take a look at this powerful creature type. This is actually the third time I've done it. I did it originally in 2017 and again in 2020, and over the last 5 years there's been a ton of movement on the list, so it's worth taking another look at them. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the dragon creature type or be capable of making a dragon creature token. In all, there were 421 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before I get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Before we get to the list proper, let's take a look at the 6 dragons that made the list in 2020, but didn't make it this time, starting with Skarrgan Hellkite, which was at number 10 last time. For 3 generic and 2 red, it's a 4/4 with flying and riot, which means that when it enters you can choose to give it haste, or put a +1/+1 counter on it. That modality is pretty nice, since sometimes you really just want to be able to smash in for 4 right away, and other times you need to stay on the defensive and make the Hellkite bigger. It also has a powerful activated ability you can use, but only if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, further incentivizing you to go with the counter. For 3 generic and a red, it does 2 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. Its points all came in standard between 2019 and 2020, where it primarily appeared as the top curve in Gruul aggro decks. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since rotating out of standard, and while 15 points was enough to make the list last time, this time it took a massive 46 points, so it's never going to return to the list. Next, there's Yosei the Morningstar, which was at number 9 last time. For 4 generic and 2 white, it's a 5/5 flyer, and when it dies, target player skips their next untap step, and you tap up to 5 of their permanents. There's a whole cycle of legendary dragons from original Kamigawa. They're all 6 mana 5/5 flyers that really put your opponent in a bind, because they come with powerful death triggers, and Yosei can get pretty close to time-walking an opponent by tapping down all their lands and not letting them untap. It saw lots of play in both block and standard back in 2005, and it was particularly nasty in standard because of Glare of Subdual, as it could really lock down the board with Glare in play. However, it has never seen play outside of block and standard. Next, it's Silumgar the Drifting Death, which was at number 8 last time, the first of several dragons hailing from the original Tarkir block in this video. It's 4 generic, a blue, and a black, and it's a 3/7 with flying and hexproof. Whenever a dragon you control attacks, creatures defending player controls get -1/-1 until end of turn. This big flyer doesn't hit as hard as most dragons do, but it's got very high toughness and hexproof, making it very challenging to take down. It also counts itself with its triggered ability, so attacking with Silumgar alone means your opponent's creatures all get -1/-1 until end of turn. This can wipe out some boards, and that's even more the case if you have some other dragons around. It was played in control decks in the standard of 2015 to 2016, many of which had various dragon payoffs and other dragons, so it was a nice fit there. It hasn't gained a single point since 2016 though. Next, it's Thunderbreak Regent, which was at number 6 last time. For 2 generic and 2 red, it's a 4/4 flyer, and whenever a dragon you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, the Regent does 3 damage to that player. So you get a fairly imposing flyer, and even if your opponent manages to kill it right away, they get bolted in the face. Might not quite be a 2-for-1, but if you're playing an aggressive deck, your opponent's life is often low enough that having them take 3 from the trigger is bad news. The Regent was largely played in aggro and mid-range decks while it was in standard, but doesn't have any top 8 since 2016. Next, there's Broodmate Dragon, which was at number 6 last time. For 3 generic, a black, a red, and a green, it's a 4/4 flyer, and it makes another 4/4 flying dragon token when it enters. It's a little challenging to cast, but that's a great deal. 8/8 worth of flying stats for only 6 mana. It also means it's really good against spot removal, since your opponent killing one of these things usually means they're coming out behind. Broodmate Dragon saw a lot of success in standard, in particular in Jund decks, which were mid-range decks loaded up with 2-for-1 effects, so the dragon was perfect for the deck, and functioned as a late-game win condition. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard though. And the last dragon from the 2020 list to fail to make it this time is Dragonlord Ojutai, who was at number 4 last time. Sort of. I actually put 3 different Dragons of Tarkir Elder Dragons in at number 4 last time, but Ojutai would have been number 5 if I gave it its own slot back then, and while the other 2 Elder Dragons are still on the list, Ojutai isn't. For 3 generic, a white and a blue, it's a 5/4 with flying and a hexproof as long as it's untapped, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you look at the top 3 cards of your library and put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. That hexproof when untapped is sweet on a creature like this, because it means you're likely to get at least one swing in, and if you do, Ojutai is a very powerful card draw effect. Ojutai was mostly played in various control decks in Standard, including those with dragon sub-themes, as well as more traditional Esper and Jeskai control decks. Ojutai also has a single point from a modern blue-white control deck. More recently, Ojutai has seen a bit of play in Pioneer Azorius aggro decks, though it doesn't have any points at all since 2020. Gaining 3 points over the last 5 years just wasn't enough for Ojutai to hold on to a spot on this list. Alright, now we've covered all the dragons from the 2020 list that aren't on it this time. Before we get to the main list, I want to ask you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I put out lots of Magic content every week, and if you've been enjoying that, I'd really appreciate the subscription, since I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, and if you subscribe, you'll help me get there. At number 10, it's Dragonlord Silumgar, which is at number 4 last time. As I mentioned earlier, I put all 3 Tarkir Dragonlords that were on the list together back in 2020, but at the time they all had pretty similar stories where they'd only been heavily played in Standard and not done a whole lot more, but at this point their stories are significantly different from one another, as evidenced by the fact that Ojutai is no longer on the list at all. Anyway, for 4 generic, a blue and a black, Dragonlord Silumgar is a 3/5 with flying and death touch, and when it enters, you gain control of a creature or planeswalker. And you maintain control of it as long as you control Dragonlord Silumgar. It definitely feels absurd to add this big body to the board and steal your opponent's best creature or planeswalker at the same time, but because Silumgar can only control that card as long as it stays in play, your opponent does have an avenue to get their creature or planeswalker back. Of course, the fact that it has such high toughness does limit the number of ways they can make that happen. The Dragonlord was commonly played in control decks while it was in Standard, and it was extra good in Dragon control decks, which could get extra value out of having dragons in their deck, like with the other Silumgar we saw earlier. While stealing creatures with it was great, it was also very well positioned against the best Planeswalker, and one of the best cards overall in that Standard format, who you would play against all the time, Gideon, ally of Zendikar. Typically, people would play Gideon and just spit out 2/2 tokens with him, which means his loyalty was usually at 4, and he just so happens to have an ultimate that's a -4. So stealing Gideon and popping off his ultimate to get that emblem for yourself was a very common play pattern. It also meant they'd never get that Gideon back. Of the 3 Dragonlords that made the list, Silumgar actually had the highest score back in 2020, but it hasn't seen very much success over the last several years, adding only a single Pioneer top 8 to its resume, so it's very likely to join Dragonlord Ojutai as a Dragonlord who is no longer on the list in the future. At number 9, it's Korvold Fae-Cursed King, which wasn't on the list last time. He existed back in 2020, but with only 12 points, he didn't make the list. For 2 generic, a black, a red, and a green, it's a legendary 4/4 flyer, and when it enters or attacks, you sacrifice another permanent. That might sound like a downside, but it's really not once you read Korvold's other ability. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. In other words, he pays you back in a really big way for giving up the permanent, and this ability also triggers off of your other sacrifice effects. This has made Korvold a very powerful payoff for sacrifice decks in Standard, Historic, and Pioneer between 2019 and 2023. In all 3 of those formats, Korvold has been played in Jund sacrifice decks alongside cards like Mayhem Devil, which give you more of a payoff for sacrificing stuff, and Woe Strider, which lets you sacrifice creatures for no mana cost. Those are just a few of the many sacrifice cards that are available to power Korvold in those decks. The Cauldron Familiar Witch's Oven combo is one of the nastier combinations with Korvold, since sacrificing the Familiar to the oven gives you the food you need to get the Familiar back, and if you have Korvold and or other sacrifice payoffs around, you're easily going to take over the game. This was so good that the Familiar actually got banned in Standard. While Jund sacrifice decks are still a thing in Pioneer, Korvold is largely moved to the wayside because he's a little bit too slow at 5 mana, so while he claimed a spot this time, if I revisit this again in 5 years, he might not be here. At number 8, it's Dragonlord Atarka. Back in 2020, I had it in the number 4 slot with the other 2 Dragonlords, but it actually had the lowest score of the 3 of them back then, and would have just been at number 7 if it had its own spot. However, over the last several years, it's added substantially to its score, unlike the other 2. For 5 generic, a red and a green, it's an 8/8 with flying and trample, and when it enters you deal 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers your opponents control. So Atarka not only gives you a massive creature that can end the game in most cases in 2 swings, its enters trigger is also likely to have a massive impact on the game, so even if your opponent manages to kill Atarka, they are likely still very far behind. In Standard, it was played in ramp decks that could get it down early. For a while, Standard was the only format it was successful in, but over the last few years, Dragonlord Atarka has begun to see play in other formats too. In Pioneer, it's played in enigmatic incarnation decks, which can tutor up a singleton copy way ahead of schedule by sacrificing one of the Duskborn Overlords. In Modern, it's seen some play in Primeval Titan ramp decks, and in Legacy, it's sometimes cheated into play in elf decks that use Natural Order. Dragonlord Atarka is still active in Pioneer and Modern right now, and it has a shot at holding onto a spot on this list in the future. At number 7, it's Ow, the Dawn Sky, a card that didn't even exist back in 2020, since it was printed in 2022's Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It's part of a cycle of legendary dragons that are a callback to Kamigawa's original dragon cycle, like Yosei, who we saw earlier. As with that cycle, they all give you a nice effect when they die. So while Yosei may have lost its spot on this list, this newer white Kamigawa dragon has continued on its legacy. Anyway, Ow is 3 generic and 2 white for a 5/4 with flying and vigilance, and when it dies, you have 2 options. You can look at the top 7 cards of your library and put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield, or you can put 2 +1/+1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or vehicle. Having these 2 choices is great because they are good in opposite situations. If your board is nicely built out, you'll just buff everything, but if you don't have much of a board presence, Owl can make sure you have one even after he goes down. And of course, you get all of that on top of this just being a huge dragon that can end the game if your opponent doesn't kill it. All of that power made Owl a fairly heavily played card while it was in Standard. At first, it was showing up in control decks and sometimes in White Weenie, but it eventually found a home in what was, for a time, the most powerful deck in the format, Esper Legends. This deck was all about playing legendary creatures and getting extra value out of them with Plaza of Heroes and the Kamigawa Channel lands, so these decks could get a ton out of having a powerful white legendary creature, especially one that was likely to allow you to make sure that there was some legendary presence on the board even after it died. The deck also ran a huge number of creatures, so putting counters on everything was often quite good too. However, after all of that success in Standard, and a bit of success in Alchemy too, Owl hasn't managed to see play in any other formats, and it looks like it's stalled out. At number 6, it's Thundermaw Hellkite, which has dropped 3 spots since 2020. For 3 generic and 2 red, it comes with flying and haste, and when it enters, it deals 1 damage to each creature with flying your opponents control and taps them. This virtually guarantees the Hellkite gets a swing in on your opponent when it comes down, and it can be particularly potent against X1 flyers like Lingering Soul tokens or Vault Scourge, both of which have been heavily played cards over the years. However, Thundermaw Hellkite doesn't have any top 8 since 2018, as there just aren't enough relevant X1 flyers in Modern for it to be worth it anymore. That is the sort of thing that could change, leading to the Hellkite finding a home in the format again, but as of right now, it's been 7 years since the last time the Hellkite put up a top 8. At number 5, it's Niv-Mizzet Parun, which was also at number 5 last time. For 3 blue and 3 red, it's a legendary 5/5 that has flying, can't be countered, and whenever you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. So Niv-Mizzet will at minimum ping something when you draw your card each turn, and then if you or your opponent cast instants or sorceries, you get to straight up draw a card, which will also give you another ping. This means that Niv-Mizzet is very hard to come out ahead of, since if your opponent points a sorcery or instant at him, you still end up getting a ping and a card. And if you're a spell heavy deck, this big dragon is a legitimate value engine. All of that power makes it well worth the somewhat challenging mana cost. He's a great win condition for control decks. The fact he can't be countered and punishes your opponent for playing instants and sorceries also makes him a nice win condition against control decks. He found success in spell decks in Standard like Izzet Drakes and Izzet Phoenix, as well as Temur Reclamation. These decks were about abusing Wilderness Reclamation, and one of the best ways to do that was with the Explosion side of Expansion Explosion, which does X damage to any target and draws a player X cards. It's a heck of a lot easier to find lethal with that when Niv is in play doing his thing. In Pioneer, Niv-Mizzet has also been played alongside Reclamation, and it's also been featured as one of the win condition in Izzet control decks. He's also a common sideboard card in Lotus Field decks, which are normally about casting a whole bunch of spells and untapping the field until you have enough mana to win the game. Niv-Mizzet can come in against opponents who are good at disrupting the combo, since he can give you an alternate way to win the game when you're casting all those spells. Lotus Field also makes it pretty easy to cast the big dragon. Niv-Mizzet is going to continue to be active in Pioneer, and it will move higher on the list in the future, especially because the card right in front of it has been far less active in the recent past, and that number 4 card is Stormbreath Dragon, which has dropped 2 spots since 2020. For 3 generic and 2 red, it's a 4/4 with flying, haste, and protection from white. It also has Monstrosity for 5 generic and 2 red, which means that if it isn't monstrous, you can pay that cost and give it 3+ and +1 counters and it becomes monstrous. And when it becomes monstrous, it deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. Stormbreath Dragon was great the entire time it was in Standard, one of the most heavily played cards in the format at various times, and it did really well in Devotion and Dragon Control. It was an amazing finisher because it could do so much damage so quickly. Abzan was one of the best decks in the format at the time, and having protection from most of their removal and creatures was also a big deal. It also has a few points here and there in other formats, usually as a sideboard card, but it has never found consistent success outside of Standard, so it's only gained 4 points over the last 5 years, and doesn't have any since early 2024, so it's likely to slip further down the list in the future. At number 3, it's Goldspan Dragon, a newcomer to the list that was only printed in 2021's Kaldheim. Like Stormbreath Dragon, it's 3 generic and 2 red for a 4/4 with flying and haste, but it has very different abilities beyond that. When it attacks or becomes a target of a spell, you create a treasure token, and your treasure also is more potent when he's around because it produces 2 mana of any one color when you sacrifice it. Because the dragon has haste, it's usually spitting out a treasure the turn it comes down, and if your opponent kills it, well, you get another treasure. That's a pretty good fail case. It's also worth noting that if you target the dragon, you're also going to get treasure. Basically, this is a big efficient dragon that spits out a ton of mana, and that's obviously a powerful thing. This led to it becoming a very heavily played card in Standard, appearing in just about any control deck that could cast it, most of which had other cards in them that produced treasure. It was especially nasty in Jeskai Hinata decks, which were all about casting spells with multiple targets at a big discount, like Magma Opus, and the dragon could help you find that mana, and you could of course target the dragon to generate more treasure if you wanted to. So it was a card that you saw all the time in Standard between 2021 and 2022. However, it only has 3 points from non-standard formats and has been completely inactive since 2023. It's not impossible for it to find consistent success outside of Standard, but it may be a little bit too expensive to ever catch on anywhere, even with the extra treasure it gives you. At number 2, it's Niv-Mizzet Reborn, the second Niv-Mizzet to make the list. While it existed back in 2020, it was a pretty new card with only 11 points, so it didn't make the list. For 1 mana of each color, he's a 6/6 flyer with an amazing Enters trigger. You get to reveal your top 10 cards, and then for each color pair, you can choose a card that's exactly those colors from among them and put them into your hand. And you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In the decks Niv is played in, most of your cards happen to be 2 colors, so you play this huge flyer and draw like 4 cards, at which point the game is usually over. He didn't make much noise in Standard because mana wasn't good enough and the card pool wasn't large enough to build a functional deck where he could draw you lots of powerful cards, but Niv-Mizzet Reborn has been a fixture in Pioneer ever since being printed. These multicolored focus decks also use Bring to Light, which is great at tutoring up Niv or any other card that might be useful in a given situation. Niv-Mizzet decks were successful in Modern 2 for several years. All of that has led to him gaining 60 points over the last 5 years, and it's not going to stop putting up top 8s in Pioneer either. There's some chance it ends up being the number 1 card on the list someday, but for now the number 1 card has a pretty big lead, and that card is Glorybringer, which was also at number 1 last time. 3 of the top 4 dragons on this list cost 3 generic and 2 red and are 4/4s with flying and haste, and all of them were dominant cards in Standard. In addition to those stats and mana cost, Glorybringer can also exert when it attacks. This means it doesn't untap during your next untap step, but in exchange, it does 4 damage to a non-dragon creature an opponent controls. In other words, this dragon can come down and remove a sizable creature while smashing in for 4, and if the board is clear, well, this big hasty dragon will end the game quickly without ever having to exert. As I mentioned, Glorybringer was utterly dominant in Standard. It was a staple in red decks, and it was one of the most played cards in the entire format. It's had more limited success in Pioneer and Modern. In the former, it showed up in some red deck wins in Rakdos Aggro, and in the latter, it's appeared in Gruul ramp decks. However, Glorybringer has been entirely inactive since 2023, and that's why Niv-Mizzet Reborn has the potential to pass it, even though it has a much lower score right now. So, those are Magic's best dragons. If you want to own any of these powerful, iconic creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on more than 830 other MTG top 10s, including more that look at specific creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.